At 9:16 p.m. on January 30th, 1945, Captain Friedrich Petersen stood on the bridge of the MV Wilhelm Gustloff, watching ice floes drift past in the freezing waters of the Baltic Sea. The massive passenger liner, once the pride of Nazi Germany's strength-through-joy fleet, was steaming west through darkness, carrying the largest concentration of humanity ever loaded onto a single vessel. Petersen had no way of knowing that in exactly 62 minutes, his ship would be gone, that 9,400 people would die in the coldest water on Earth, that it would be the deadliest maritime disaster in human history, 6 times worse than the Titanic, and that the world would barely remember it happened. The Wilhelm Gustloff had been built in 1937 as a cruise ship for German workers, part of the Nazi regime's propaganda program showing how the Third Reich cared for ordinary citizens. She was 684 feet long, displaced 25,484 tons, and was designed to carry 1,465 passengers in comfort across the Atlantic. She had staterooms with private bathrooms, dining halls that could seat hundreds, a swimming pool, a theater, sun decks and promenades. Everything a luxury liner needed to show the world that National Socialism could deliver prosperity to the masses. But the Wilhelm Gustloff never carried tourists on pleasure cruises. War began 2 years after her launch. She was immediately converted to a hospital ship, then a barracks for naval trainees, then a floating refugee transport. By January 1945, she was Germany's last hope for evacuating the eastern territories. The Soviet Red Army was advancing across Poland and East Prussia, driving millions of German civilians west in the coldest winter in decades. The roads were clogged with refugees, women, children, elderly people fleeing the approaching Russians with whatever they could carry. They had heard the stories. What happened when the Red Army reached German towns? The mass rapes, the executions, the revenge for 4 years of Nazi atrocities on Soviet soil. The stories were true. Soviet soldiers were not liberators. They were conquerors seeking vengeance. Every German civilian in their path was potential retribution for Stalingrad, for Leningrad, for 27 million Soviet citizens killed by German invasion. German civilians were running for their lives, and the only escape route was across the Baltic Sea. Operation Hannibal was the largest maritime evacuation in history. Between January and May 1945, the German Navy evacuated over 2 million civilians from East Prussia, Poland, and the Baltic states. Thousands of ships, passenger liners, cargo vessels, fishing boats, anything that could float, ferried refugees across the Baltic to German ports still under Nazi control. The Wilhelm Gustloff was flagship of this desperate exodus. On January 30th, 1945, she was docked at the port of Gotenhafen, modern-day Gdynia, Poland, loading refugees for the journey to Kiel in northern Germany. The ship was designed for 1,465 passengers. The German Navy had calculated she could safely carry 3,000 people in emergency conditions. Over 10,000 people boarded that day. They came in waves, families with children, pregnant women, elderly couples who could barely walk. They carried suitcases, bundles of clothes, family photographs, everything they owned in the world. Behind them, 60 miles away, Soviet artillery was shelling German positions. They could hear the guns. The refugees climbed the gangways and kept coming. The crew tried to maintain order, to count people, to enforce capacity limits. It was impossible. Every person turned away was potentially a person condemned to death when the Russians arrived. So they kept loading and loading and loading. The passenger cabins filled first, then the dining halls, then the corridors, then the swimming pool drained and converted to sleeping space. People packed into every available area. They slept standing up because there was no room to lie down. The exact number who boarded is unknown. Records were not kept. Estimates range from 10,300 to 10,600 people. Among them, 918 German naval officers and crew training on the ship, 373 female naval auxiliaries, young women who served as communications specialists and administrative staff, 162 wounded soldiers being evacuated from field hospitals, and approximately 9,000 civilians, mostly women and children, mothers carrying infants, pregnant women in their final trimester, children separated from their parents in the chaos of boarding, elderly refugees who had survived World War I and now faced death in World War II. At 12:30 p.m. on January 30th, Captain Peterson requested permission to depart. Naval Command denied the request. A minesweeper escort that was supposed to accompany the Wilhelm Gustloff hadn't arrived. Sailing without escort through submarine-infested waters was suicide. Peterson argued that staying in port was equally dangerous. Soviet aircraft were bombing German positions daily. Gotenhafen would fall within weeks, maybe days. The refugees needed to be evacuated immediately. At 2:00 p.m., Peterson received new orders: depart as soon as possible. Escort or no escort, the Wilhelm Gustloff needed to get those refugees out of the combat zone. But there was a problem. The ship had been stationary in port for weeks. Barnacles and ice had accumulated on the hull. The maximum speed, normally 16 knots, was reduced to 12 knots, maybe less, and 12 knots wasn't fast enough to outrun Soviet submarines. Peterson knew this. His officers knew this. But what choice did they have? Leave the refugees in Gotenhafen to face the Red Army, or risk the submarine danger and hope for the best? At 12:30 p.m., the Wilhelm Gustloff departed Gotenhafen accompanied by one torpedo boat, the TF-1, not the minesweeper escort they'd requested, not a destroyer with anti-submarine weapons. Just one small torpedo boat against whatever Soviet submarines were hunting in the Baltic. It wasn't enough. Everyone knew it wasn't enough. The refugees didn't know. They were just grateful to be leaving. They crowded the decks as the ship left port, watching the coast of Poland recede into the distance. They were escaping. They were safe. They believed they would reach Germany and start rebuilding their lives. Some would reunite with husbands and sons serving in the Wehrmacht. Others would wait out the war's final months and return home when the fighting ended. Most wouldn't survive the night. At 6:00 p.m., the temperature had dropped to degrees C. Wind speeds increased. The Baltic Sea, notorious for violent winter storms, was becoming rough. Waves crashed over the bow. Ice formed on the railings and superstructure. Peterson ordered all passengers below deck. The upper decks were too dangerous in these conditions. People could be washed overboard by the waves or freeze to death in the wind. 10,000 people crowded into spaces designed for 1,500. The air became stifling despite the cold. Bodies pressed against each other, children crying, women praying, everyone trying to find a space where they could sit or lie down. In the drained swimming pool, hundreds of refugees huddled together for warmth. The tile walls offered no insulation. Condensation from their breath froze on the ceiling and fell as ice crystals. Some refugees tried to sleep. Most couldn't. The ship was rolling heavily in the storm. People who had never been on a ship before were seasick, vomiting in corners because there was no access to bathrooms. The bathrooms had stopped working anyway. 10,000 people using facilities designed for 1,500 had overwhelmed the plumbing systems within hours of departure. This was what desperation looked like. People willing to endure any hardship because the alternative, staying behind, was worse. At 9:00 p.m., Peterson faced another critical decision. Standard procedure for vessels traveling through submarine waters was to sail close to shore in shallow water where submarines couldn't operate, with lights extinguished and radio silence maintained. But the coastal route was heavily mined. German forces had laid thousands of mines to prevent Soviet naval forces from advancing. The minesweeper that was supposed to escort the Wilhelm Gustloff would have cleared a safe path. Without the minesweeper, the coastal route was a death trap. Peterson's alternative was to sail in deeper water, farther from shore. This avoided the minefields but put the ship directly in the path of Soviet submarines hunting in the shipping lanes. He chose the deep water route. Then he made a second decision that would haunt the survivors forever. He ordered the ship's navigation lights turned on. This violated every protocol for sailing through hostile waters. Lights made the ship visible from miles away, a perfect target for any submarine in the area. Peterson's reasoning: a German minesweeper convoy was traveling east through the same waters. In darkness, in rough seas, there was a risk of collision. Better to risk submarine attack than to have two German vessels crash into each other. At least, that was the official explanation. Some crew members later claimed Peterson believed the ship was outside the Soviet submarine patrol zone. Others said he thought navigation lights would identify the Wilhelm Gustloff as a refugee vessel, not a military target. Whatever his reasoning, the decision was catastrophic. At 9:04 p.m., Soviet submarine S-13 was cruising submerged 30 miles off the coast of East Prussia. Captain Alexander Marinesko was hunting for targets, any German vessel he could sink. Marinesko was a controversial figure in the Soviet Navy. He was undeniably skilled, one of the most successful submarine commanders in the Baltic Fleet. He was also undisciplined, frequently drunk, and had recently been reprimanded for disappearing on a multi-day drinking binge while his submarine was scheduled for combat operations. His superiors had threatened to relieve him of command. This patrol was his last chance to prove he deserved to remain a submarine captain. At 9:08 p.m., Marinesko's sonar operator detected a contact. Large vessel, moving slowly. Range, approximately 12 miles. Marinesko ordered the submarine to periscope depth and looked through the scope. What he saw made him think he was hallucinating. A massive passenger liner, fully lit, sailing alone through waters that should have been empty of civilian traffic. He couldn't believe German command would be stupid enough to send a liner through submarine-infested waters with navigation lights on. It had to be a trap. A decoy designed to lure Soviet submarines to the surface where German aircraft could attack them. Marinesko watched for 20 minutes, analyzing the target. No escort vessels visible. No aircraft overhead. The ship was zigzagging slightly, a defensive maneuver, but not aggressively enough to suggest military awareness. Either this was the most elaborate trap in naval history, or it was a legitimate target being sailed by idiots. At 9:16 p.m., Marinesko decided to attack. S-13 maneuvered into attack position. Marinesko calculated the target's speed, 12 knots, distance, 3,000 yards, and angle. He programmed 3 torpedoes for a spread pattern. If the first missed, the second or third would hit. He gave the order to fire. At 9:16 p.m., 3 Type 53 torpedoes launched from S-13's forward tubes. Each torpedo carried 880 pounds of TNT. They crossed the 3,000 yards to the Wilhelm Gustloff in approximately 90 seconds, their electric motors leaving no wake visible to lookouts. The first torpedo struck the ship's bow, directly below the waterline in the forward compartments where 918 naval trainees were quartered. The explosion vaporized everything in the immediate area. Men sleeping in bunks ceased to exist. Others were killed by the shockwave, their internal organs ruptured. The blast tore a hole 30 feet wide in the hull. The Baltic Sea poured in at thousands of gallons per second. The compartment flooded in less than a minute. Men who survived the explosion found themselves trapped in darkness as freezing water rose around them. The watertight doors had sealed automatically, locking them inside. They pounded on the steel doors and screamed for help that would never come. They drowned in darkness, clawing at walls that wouldn't move, choking on seawater that was cold enough to kill in minutes even without drowning. The second torpedo struck amidships, near the drained swimming pool where hundreds of refugees were sheltering. The explosion tore through the hull and into the pool area. The detonation in the confined space was catastrophic. People were killed by the blast wave, their bodies thrown against tile walls hard enough to shatter bones. Others were buried under collapsing debris as the ceiling gave way. Seawater flooded into the swimming pool area, trapping everyone inside, mothers clutching children. Elderly refugees who couldn't move fast enough, all of them drowning in a swimming pool that had been drained specifically to provide shelter. The third torpedo struck aft, near the engine room. The explosion destroyed the ship's electrical system. The lights went out, all of them. The entire ship went dark in an instant. 10,000 people plunged into absolute blackness. The engines died. The propellers stopped. The Wilhelm Gustloff lost all power and began drifting in the storm. In the darkness, people screamed. They couldn't see where they were. They couldn't see the exits. They couldn't see the rising water. Captain Peterson was thrown against the bridge console by the first torpedo impact. He pulled himself upright and immediately tried to assess the damage through reports from his crew. No bow response. No power. No communications. The ship was listing 15 degrees to port and the angle was increasing rapidly. He ordered abandon ship at 9:18 p.m., 2 minutes after the torpedoes struck, but there was no way to communicate the order. The public address system was dead. The electrical alarms were offline. No bells rang. No sirens wailed. Peterson's order to abandon ship had to be passed by word of mouth through a ship that was breaking apart in the darkness, through corridors packed with thousands of panicking people, through compartments that were already flooding. Most of the 10,000-plus people aboard never heard the order to abandon ship. In the darkness below deck, chaos consumed all rational thought. People stampeded toward where they remembered the exits being. They climbed over each other, pushed through crowds, trampled anyone who fell. Women were separated from children. Families were torn apart in the crush of bodies forcing through passageways. The stairways became death traps. Thousands of people trying to climb narrow stairs in complete darkness while the ship tilted further to port. People fell. Others climbed over them. Bodies piled up at the bottoms of stairwells, blocking escape routes. Some refugees never made it out of the interior compartments. They were trapped in the dining halls, the passenger cabins, the cargo holds. Water rose around them in darkness. They drowned without ever seeing the ocean that killed them. Those who reached the upper decks found a different nightmare. The ship's lifeboats were frozen solid. Weeks of sub-zero temperatures had encased the davits in ice. The crew hacked at the ice with axes and hammers trying to free the boats. Some succeeded, most didn't. Of the 22 lifeboats aboard the Wilhelm Gustloff, only 5 could be launched. 5 lifeboats for over 10,000 people. The crew tried to maintain order, women and children first, but there was no order anymore. People fought for spaces in the boats. Men threw women aside to climb aboard. Parents lifted children into boats and were pulled back by other refugees desperate to save themselves. One lifeboat launched with 40 people aboard. Designed capacity was 50. As it was lowered down the side of the ship, dozens of people jumped from the deck trying to reach it. They landed on the people already in the boat, capsizing it. Everyone spilled into the Baltic Sea. The water temperature was cold enough to kill an unprotected human in 15 minutes. Maybe 20 if you were lucky. No one was lucky that night. People who jumped or fell into the water died almost immediately, not from drowning, from cold water shock. The freezing temperature triggered involuntary gasping reflexes. They inhaled seawater. Their hearts stopped. Their bodies shut down. Some survived the initial shock and managed to stay afloat. They had life jackets. They could swim. They could see the Wilhelm Gustloff silhouette against the sky, see other people in the water around them. They lasted maybe 10 minutes before hypothermia killed them. Their core body temperatures dropped. Their muscles stopped responding. They couldn't keep their heads above water anymore. They slipped beneath the surface without a sound. The children died first. Their smaller bodies lost heat faster. Mothers held them above the water, trying to keep them warm, watching them stop moving, stop breathing, stop being alive. Then the mothers died, still clutching their frozen children. On the upper decks, the Wilhelm Gustloff was rolling further to port. The starboard side was rising into the air. People clung to railings, to deck fixtures, to anything bolted down. Some jumped before the ship could take them under. They leaped from heights of 40, 50, 60 feet as the ship tilted. They hit the water and went under. Most never came back up. Others held on, waiting, hoping, praying. Maybe the ship would stabilize. Maybe rescue vessels would arrive. Maybe this wasn't really happening. At 9:28 p.m., 12 minutes after the torpedoes struck, the Wilhelm Gustloff's bridge went underwater. Captain Peterson was still there. He had remained on the bridge following naval tradition. The captain stays with his ship. He could have evacuated. He chose not to. He drowned at his post as the Baltic Sea poured through the bridge windows. The ship continued rolling. The port side submerged completely. The starboard side rose higher, exposing the propellers and rudder. The Wilhelm Gustloff hung there for a moment, vertical, pointing at the storm clouds, a monument to the worst maritime disaster in history. Then she slipped beneath the surface. The Wilhelm Gustloff sank in exactly 40 minutes. From torpedo impact to complete submersion, 40 minutes. Faster than most people could evacuate. Faster than rescuers could arrive. Fast enough to kill over 9,000 people. The suction created by the sinking pulled hundreds more people underwater. Those who had managed to swim away from the ship were dragged back toward the vortex. They fought the current and lost. They were pulled down into the darkness and drowned. Silence fell across the ocean. Then the screaming began. Thousands of people floated in the Baltic Sea, scattered across miles of darkness. Most had life jackets. Most would die anyway. The temperature was killing them minute by minute. Their bodies were shutting down. Hypothermia was progressing through its stages, shivering violently, then confusion, then loss of consciousness, then death. People called out names in the darkness. Mothers searching for children, husbands searching for wives, children crying for parents who were already dead. A young mother named Ng Bendrich floated in the water holding her 18-month-old daughter. She had managed to grab a life jacket before jumping from the ship. Her daughter had none. Bendrich held her daughter above the water, using her own body to shield the child from the waves. She could feel her daughter getting colder, feel the small body going limp in her arms. After 10 minutes, her daughter stopped crying. After 15 minutes, she stopped moving. Bendrich continued holding her dead child, unable to accept what had happened, unable to let go. Eventually, her own body gave out. She and her daughter drowned together. This scene repeated thousands of times across the ocean, parents watching their children die. Children watching their parents die. Strangers clinging to each other for warmth as hypothermia claimed them both. The 5 lifeboats that had successfully launched drifted in the darkness, packed with survivors who couldn't help those still in the water. Taking on more people would swamp the boats and kill everyone. They listened to the screaming and tried to block it out, tried not to think about the voices that stopped one by one as people died. At 10:18 p.m., the torpedo boat TF-1, the Wilhelm Gustloff's sole escort, arrived at the scene of the sinking. The captain looked out at an ocean covered with bodies, debris, and dying people. His small vessel could hold maybe 50 additional passengers. There were thousands in the water. He began pulling people aboard anyway. His crew threw lines to anyone close enough to grab them. They hauled frozen, half-dead refugees onto the deck. Some were already dead by the time they were pulled from the water. Others died minutes later, their bodies too damaged by hypothermia to recover. TF-1 pulled 564 people from the water before reaching maximum capacity. The small torpedo boat was so overloaded, it was in danger of capsizing. The captain made an agonizing decision: stop rescuing people and head for port before his own vessel sank. He ordered engines ahead and left the scene. Behind him, thousands of people were still dying in the water. He could hear them screaming. He could do nothing. Other German vessels arrived over the next few hours. The torpedo boat T-36 rescued 98 people. The minesweeper M387 rescued 37. The torpedo recovery boat TF-19 rescued 7. Total rescued from the water, 706 people. The rest, over 9,400 people, died in the Baltic Sea on the night of January 30th, 1945. It remains the deadliest maritime disaster in recorded history, 6 times more casualties than the Titanic. More than the Lusitania, the Empress of Ireland, and the Sultana combined, and most of the world has never heard of it. The survivors were taken to German ports and given medical treatment for hypothermia, frostbite, and injuries. Many required amputations of frozen fingers and toes. Some were so traumatized they couldn't speak. The German Navy imposed a complete information blackout. The sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff was classified top secret. Survivors were ordered not to discuss what happened. Families were told their loved ones had been killed during evacuation operations, with no details provided. The secrecy was strategic. Germany was losing the war. Public morale was already shattered. News that 9,400 refugees had been killed in a single sinking would be catastrophic. Better to classify it, bury it, pretend it didn't happen. The blackout lasted until after Germany surrendered in May 1945. Even then, the story barely registered. The world was processing millions of deaths, concentration camps, atomic bombs. A single ship sinking, even with 9,400 casualties, couldn't compete for attention. For the Soviet Union, the Wilhelm Gustloff was a military victory. Captain Marinesko had sunk the largest vessel in German hands. His superiors initially considered it the greatest submarine attack of the war. Then they learned what the ship had been carrying: 9,400 people, mostly women and children. Refugees fleeing the advancing Red Army. This created a propaganda problem. The Soviet Union wanted to be seen as liberators, not as killers of German civilians. The Wilhelm Gustloff sinking didn't fit that narrative, so the Soviet government classified it as well. Marinesko received the Order of the Red Banner for the attack, but the details were suppressed. Soviet records described the Wilhelm Gustloff as a military transport carrying Nazi military personnel. The 9,000 civilian casualties were never mentioned. Marinesko's career ended badly. He continued his drinking and indiscipline. In 1945, he was dismissed from the Navy for stealing and selling government property. He spent 3 years in a labor camp, then worked as a supply manager until his death in 1963. In 1990, after the Soviet Union collapsed, Marinesko was posthumously named Hero of the Soviet Union for sinking the Wilhelm Gustloff. The civilian casualties were acknowledged but described as regrettable but unavoidable during wartime. The survivors spent decades trying to get their story recognized. Most lost their entire families in the sinking. A mother and her 3 children all drowned. A father and his 2 daughters frozen to death in the water. Entire family lines erased in 40 minutes. The survivors wanted the world to know what happened. They wanted memorials. They wanted recognition. They wanted the 9,400 dead to be remembered. But Germany was processing its own guilt. The Holocaust, the war crimes, the atrocities committed in Germany's name. There was limited sympathy for German suffering when Germany had caused so much suffering. The Wilhelm Gustloff survivors were told to be quiet. Your tragedy is real, but it's inconvenient. German civilians dying doesn't fit the narrative we need right now. So they stayed quiet. For decades, it wasn't until the 1990s that serious historical research began on the Wilhelm Gustloff disaster. Books were published, documentaries were made, survivors gave interviews. By then, most of the survivors were dead. Inge Bendrich, the mother who held her daughter above the water, had died in 1987 without ever speaking publicly about that night. Thousands of other survivors died without telling their stories. The last survivor died in 2018 at age 92. With her death, the last living witness to the worst maritime disaster in history was gone. But the story remains. 9,400 people died in the Baltic Sea on January 30th, 1945. They died because 3 torpedoes hit their ship. They died because the lifeboats were frozen. They died because the water was cold enough to kill in 15 minutes. They died because they were refugees fleeing a war their government had started, caught between armies that saw them as acceptable casualties. And they died in obscurity, their tragedy classified, suppressed, forgotten by a world that had too many other horrors to process. The Wilhelm Gustloff lies at the bottom of the Baltic Sea, 450 feet down, 30 miles off the coast of Poland. It's a war grave. Diving is prohibited. The ship will remain there forever, a tomb for the thousands who went down with her. No memorial marks the site. No flowers are laid. No ceremonies are held. Just silence and cold water and 9,400 people who died screaming in the darkness. If this story moved you, hit that like button. Every like tells YouTube to share this with more people who need to hear it. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We bring you the forgotten tragedies of history every single day. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. This is the deadliest maritime disaster in history, and most people have never heard of it. 9,400 people died in 40 minutes. They deserve to be remembered, even if it took 80 years for the world to listen. Thank you for watching. Thank you for making sure the Wilhelm Gustloff is not forgotten.